Today we have with us Michael Eisenhart, who is the owner of Eisenhart Tax and Financial. He is a monthly contributor to DadsDivorce.com. The website is eisentax.com. That's ISNTAX.com. Mr. Eisenhart is also a tax instructor with Southwest Illinois University for quite some time. And today we're going to discuss the most recent article, Our Plan of Attacks by Mr. Eisenhart, dealing with final regulations affecting your right to claim your child as a dependent. Mr. Eisenhart, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And today we're going to talk about a topic that is probably near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, dealing with the tax implications of being able to claim your child as a dependent. And when I was reading the article, there's apparently some new regulations that are in effect, that there's been some changes regarding that you just can't submit a final decree. There's the Form 8332 must be used as well, correct?
Yes. There's been a lot of proposed regulations a couple years back, and they took that and took what they didn't think they were addressing and then came out with some final regulations here last year. And they go into effect for years after July 1st, 2008, which basically is saying, well, it's, calendar year taxpayers. We're looking at January 1st, 2009. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to address this. It's still, the ink's still somewhat wet, and try to understand and help other people understand these new changes, because they will impact people in a lot of different ways, I think, now than in the past.
Sure. So for the people tuning in and listening to us, the big question that is now on their mind are, what are these new changes?
Well, there's the final regulations, and from my interpretation, what I could see, there's three major changes that are going into effect here. And first of which is that, how a non-custodial spouse should go about obtaining the release of the exemption from the custodial spouse is one. The other is what is the definition of a custodial spouse? And then the third is, when can a signed release be unilaterally revoked? So we've got some interesting changes going on in the books that I think will be of interest to the audience.
Exactly. And let's just kind of jump right to the changes, since unfortunately we're limited in time. You mentioned that on the first change, that a state order can no longer be used as a written declarations for purposes of substituting the Form 8332.
Mm-hmm.
What is the next process, or what has to be, or what is changed now? What does one person have to do in order to make sure that they're following and that they're current with this first change?
Well, when you look at the nature of what the law is trying to accomplish, it appears as though what they're saying is that we don't want a bunch of other things on this form or this statement or this substitute. We want it to be for the sole purpose of releasing that exemption. And so they say the Form 8332, which is the form that releases the exemption, or any substitute that follows by the guidelines of Form 8332. So the substitute form basically needs to be like 8332 in that it states the years. It is an unconditional release. In other words, you can't state that, hey, you have to be up to date on child support or alimony in order to make that release. So it has to be unconditional and as well state the years.
And then the second...
It must be for the sole purpose of releasing the exemption, too.
And then the second change is dealing with what is the definition of the custodial parent, correct?
Yes, it is. And so they were looking at what really does determine custody. And so they said, well, they came up and proposed regulations, and they made it final, is let's look at the definition, and let's define what is a custodial parent and when a parent can be considered custodial. For example, a custodial parent for tax purposes is the one where the child spends more nights with that parent than they do the other parent. So the one with the most nights spent becomes the custodial, and the other parent becomes the non-custodial parent.
Now, in your article, you mentioned the counting nights rule. Can you explain what that is?
Well, the counting nights rule is basically saying, first of which we have to look at a few things. One of which is that we're making the assumption that over half the support of the child was provided by the parents, that the child lived with one or both of the parents over half of the year. So once we look at that, then we're looking at how many nights did that child actually stay with each parent. So once those conditions are satisfied, how many nights were there? And the one with the most nights becomes the custodial parent. And as I think all of us will, have experienced in the past, that sometimes particularly I have in my practice with people that come in, they'll look at the divorce decree as, well, that's stating that she is the custodial spouse. And for tax purposes, that may not necessarily be the case now, and I believe that's what the nature and intent of these final regulations was, to say, look, the divorce decree cannot state what's going to happen in the future. It's going to be on a year-by-year analysis.
Mm-hmm. What are the tax benefits to the custodial parent?
Well, the custodial parent, it has the right to either keep the dependent or release it to the non-custodial parent. So let's take, for example, that the custodial parent chooses to keep the exemption. Well, then, if allowable, they are entitled to the head of household filing status, earned income credit, child and dependent care credit, and as well, they also get the child tax credit and the education credits. Now, that's if they keep the exemption. If they release the exemption, then the non-custodial spouse will get certain benefits, but the custodial spouse, or custodial parent, I should say, they're not spouses anymore, but the custodial parent will still retain the rights, if allowable, to head of household status, earned income credit, and child and dependent care credit.
Even though they release?
Yes.
Now, what tax benefits are there for the non-custodial parent?
So the non-custodial parent, of course, is the one that did not have the child as many nights, and so they have to have this exemption released to them from the custodial parent. Now, once it's released to them, the non-custodial parent is allowed to claim the child as a tax exemption, and as well, they get the child tax credit and any education credits, if applicable.
Mm-hmm. Now, jumping back to doing the counting nights rule, is there any I remember when I was reading through your article, there are certain exceptions to the counting nights rule.
There is one exception, and the exception is this, and it's trying to address these instances where you have, and I'm summarizing based upon my what I read through it. But it appears what they're trying to do is address situations where you have one parent who really is the custodial parent, but because of their work shift, they work the nights. That the exception states that if that parent has that child the majority of the days, and the child is registered at school for their home, then that exception comes into play, and then they, in fact, are the custodial parent. But that's the only exception that's available.
Now, since these changes have been implemented, do you foresee any type of problems that may arise as a result of what has just been implemented?
There are a lot of problems I can kind of foresee in what's going on here. And of course, we haven't talked about the unilateral revocation, but I could take a moment